Donald Trump has said all options must be on the table, which seems to imply the use of military force somehow against a fellow NATO member. And I just can't countenance that. I think that's a irresponsible kind of rhetoric, I'll be so bold to say. But on the other hand, I do think that the NATO allies, as well as Denmark itself, seem ready to talk to the United States about bolstering a U.S. presence in Greenland, including a presence at the airbase there to enhance our ability across the board in NATO to get early warning of Russian attacks, and also then to be able to have better control of the sea lines of communication in the area. So I do think that there are ways that the U.S. presence and involvement in Greenland can be strengthened and reinforced, and that NATO should be ready to support that. But talk of use of military forces should not be countenanced, in my view.
Rose Gottemoeller, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Let me ask you, first of all, there is now a clear and pretty vicious trade war going on between the US and Canada. I mean, one of the questions that was put to the NATO Secretary General today, I'd like to ask you, I mean, do you think that those strains between two important NATO members, do you think they add to the strains on NATO?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure how long this vicious trade war is going to last. I take note that the Mexican president very quickly came to a deal with Mr. Trump to place 10,000 Mexican really very skilled troops along the border to prevent the flow of narcotics into the United States and high-powered weapons into Mexico. And so the sanctions, the tariffs rather, have been stopped for the moment in Mexico. And apparently the president of the United States will be talking with the Prime Minister of Canada at 3 p.m. Eastern today. So we'll see what comes out of that. But I get the feeling that Trump is ready to make a deal and seems to be signaling as long as the drug flow is stopped as he sees it, then some accommodation can be reached. So I'm not really too bothered today about this, but we will see how long it goes on.
The big focus of Sir Keir Starmer's trip to Europe today is all about security. He's talking a lot about the need for the UK and EU members to cooperate more, and of course about the importance of bolstering Ukraine in the war with Russia. Do you think that there is a risk that talk of some sort of new EU defence pact could conflict with what the NATO alliance is trying to do?
I think it's entirely practical for the European Union to be building up its defense cooperation inside the EU, while at the same time cooperating intensively and closely with NATO. And that is very consistent with the view I've held since I was Deputy Secretary General of NATO from 2016 to 19. Already at that time, the EU was thinking about bolstering its own defense role, and the French have been very insistent on that now for some period of time. I think it's important that the EU and NATO not essentially double up on the work. They shouldn't have redundant capabilities, but should support each other in various ways. The EU, for example, I think can do a lot to simplify and improve defense industry performance in Europe, and that's not NATO's role, but they can really cooperate in a way that's mutually beneficial.
And do you think it's even more important, perhaps, for EU nations to be doing what they can to support Ukraine at a time when Donald Trump, there are clearly a lot of concerns about his approach to the war in Ukraine, how much support he's prepared to continue to give to the country?
Look, I think it's going to be important for both the UK and the European Union to work closely together to continue to support Ukraine during this uncertain period when apparently there is some behind the scenes work going on between Washington and I guess Moscow as well as Kyiv to get some negotiations organized. And so it's going to be important for there to be staunch support of Ukraine throughout this period to make sure they're in the best possible position to come to the negotiating table. There's one other factor here that worries me quite a bit, and you may have seen the news reports this morning that Elon Musk has gone after the USAID, the aid organization that has been providing assistance to Ukraine on things like governance and medical support and other very important functions. And now it's been completely halted in its activities worldwide, not only in Ukraine, but elsewhere. So it's very important that the European Union and the UK continue to support also the non-military aspects of assistance to Ukraine at this moment, because otherwise I am concerned that the government in Kiev will just simply falter and may fail.
Donald Trump said during his campaign, and indeed since, that NATO members should be spending 5% of their GDP on defence, something which, as I understand it, not even the US actually does. The UK is not even up to 2.5% yet. How big an issue and a concern do you think that is? There are many, many NATO members that spend nothing like that. Do you think we should see this as just a Trump opening gambit in his next negotiation, or do you think that there are real concerns that the US might withdraw from at least part of its role within NATO unless other NATO members spend more?
My view has been that it is indeed an opening gambit in a negotiation. Already last summer, when the NATO member states met in Washington for their 75th anniversary summit, they agreed that 2% of gross domestic product was not enough, that it was not a ceiling, but a floor. And so they are already talking about going higher. I understand the number hovers around 3%. Both the Secretary General, Mark Rutte, and other NATO members meeting informally today in the EU, under the EU umbrella, but also with Keir Starmer in attendance, they seem to be discussing this very actively. So I won't be surprised. It seems the NATO member states are ready to go higher, and Trump has laid out his initial negotiating position. I won't be surprised at the next NATO summit in Lithuania next summer that we'll see the numbers. I'm sorry, it's going to be in Copenhagen next summer that the number will indeed go higher.
And And do you think that the UK should be taking more of a lead on this? I mean, the Labour government under Keir Starmer hasn't even set out a date by which it's going to reach 2.5%. As an important NATO player, should the UK be going a bit faster on this?
Right. And Carol, I have to correct myself. I have been thinking a lot about Copenhagen because of the Greenland situation you may want to
Sure.
discuss, but the upcoming summit meeting will be in the Netherlands next summer. So back to your question, though, I absolutely believe the UK can play a strong role in this upcoming discussion of how much NATO will spend across the board in terms of percentage of GDP, because always the UK has been strong and on time in insisting it would be ready to spend 2% of GDP. It's above it now. You're right, it's not quite at 2.5% yet, but I do think that it will be an important player, important in terms of evidently the trust that's already beginning to develop between Keir Starmer and Donald Trump. And so, all in all, I do believe that the UK will play an important role here.
Donald Trump does seem to be serious about his claim on Greenland, which of course is a Danish territory. How should NATO respond to that, given that, of course, the US is the key player in NATO?
Well, cautiously, because unfortunately, in my view, Donald Trump has said all options must be on the table, which seems to imply the use of military force somehow against a fellow NATO member. And I just can't countenance that. I think that's a irresponsible kind of rhetoric, I'll be so bold to say. But on the other hand, I do think that the NATO allies, as well as Denmark itself, seem ready to talk to the United States about bolstering a U.S. presence in Greenland, including a presence at the airbase there to enhance our ability across the board in NATO to get early warning of Russian attacks attacks, and also then to be able to have better control of the sea lines of communication in the area. So I do think that there are ways that the U.S. presence and involvement in Greenland can be strengthened and reinforced, and that NATO should be ready to support that. But talk of use of military forces should not be countenanced, in my view.
But this could put really serious strains on the NATO alliance, couldn't it?
Of course, it would if Mr. Trump proceeds with that kind of threat. But I really think that it's not going to be necessary. And you see it today in the rapid response, as I put it a moment ago, to the Mexican president's gesture that Mr. Trump was ready to back off his most serious threats. And so I think it is about a negotiation. It is about a transaction, and thinking through what makes best sense for NATO, NATO's defense, and indeed the health of the Greenland economy going forward, because there's an aspect of that that's at play here. Involvement of U.S. companies there, et cetera, also I think will be important.